Hey everyone. We are going to slow things down a little bit this week and start to get into the nitty-gritties of this fun, fantastic, wonderful interactive bar chart that we have created through our example from last week. And the reason we're going to do this, of course, as you know, is because we really care about the details around designing our charts, right? A chart is, a chart is not a chart, is not a chart, is not a chart. There are ways in which we can make our charts more legible, more informative, more clear, more informational in a sense based on how we design them. And so what we're going to do is we're going to take all of the progress that we made over the last few weeks and we're going to start to look at customizing elements of these charts so that we can really get the look and feel that we want, so we can make sure that we're telling the story that we want to be telling with our visualizations. So to that end, we're just going to build on last week's programming assignment, which should get you to about this place. Actually, if you take a look at my code, the only difference here is that in my HTML page, I've done it as an internal or a style sheet within the HTML page. You are more than welcome and frankly encouraged to make it an HTML page, to make it an external CSS file. But I just want to highlight for you guys a couple of things, one of which is that the main part of which is that when we did this example, one of the pieces that we just sort of copied verbatim out of the Google Visualizations example, which you can see at this link, right? This is the bar chart documentation link that's in your syllabus, right? So if I come here, one of the things we did is we just kind of grabbed this options piece and pasted it into our code and said, we'll worry about that later, right? Now, if we do a side-by-side comparison, it's not that difficult for us to see what's happening here, right? We see title, company performance. If we come back here, we see, oh yes, the title of our chart is company performance. If we look at the vertical, we look at this, we see vertical axis title year, text title style color red. And if we look for corresponding material, we see that there is red text with the word year on our vertical axis here. So what we're seeing here is the beginnings of our ability to customize the appearance of this Google visualization chart. And what we're going to focus on this week is looking at all of the many ways, or some of the many ways, each of you will be looking at different specific aspects that we can customize this. So let's start where we are, which is to say that we have this options variable in our code, and we see something like title and company performance. So I'm going to actually call this population of the 50 states plus DC, right? Not necessarily the exact wording I would use in my final chart perhaps, but for now that'll be fine. So you see that I actually haven't changed projects in this case, and you guys don't need to actually change projects to do this. So I'm going to go ahead and upload this, hopefully. Come on. Oops, it doesn't want to let me do that. There we go. Okay, it's a little finicky, as we know. Okay, and if I do this, we can see that I've changed the title. So how do we figure out exactly what format we're supposed to put some of the rest of these things in, and also what is available to us to customize? And that's the answer to that is where our API documentation comes in. So on this same page, if we go back to the top, we see this configuration options element, right? And you can see that there's a long, long list here of things that can be customized. And so what we need to do is start to work with how we actually implement these styles inside our own visualization. And so we're going to employ a divide and conquer mechanism here, because what's going to happen, we're going to assign each of you some aspects of this to explore. But in the meantime, we're going to show a couple of examples of how this works. Now, one thing that I went ahead and did for my own purposes and for the purposes of our class group here is, you can see that one of the things they do here is they say animation.duration. And they call that the name of the parameter. Now, we're not going to worry about animation at this point, but let's take a look at something like background color, which has a pretty, I'd say a pretty straightforward understanding for us, right? We can see if we look at it, the name is background color, the type string or object, it says. Not entirely sure what that means. I mean, I understand what a string or an object is, but it doesn't tell me anything really about what that object might be at this point, so I'm going to sort of hold off on that. And it says default white. And it says the background color of the main area of the chart can be either a simple HTML color string, red, or an object with the following properties. Now, this is where the quality of the documentation kind of stumbles a little bit, in my opinion, because it's not quite so obvious what they mean by that. So we're going to unpack this example, and as I said, for the purposes of this class, I created kind of a cheat sheet for myself. And what that is I looked at each top level configuration option, and where there were dot properties, I sort of nested them underneath it. Now, why did I do this? Because duration in this case is a property of animation, right? It only exists as a sub-property of it. In the same way, we have background color, which, as we've seen, can be either a string, as specified in the documentation, or it can be an object with these properties in it. So let's take this as an example and see how the format of our documentation actually translates into code, right? Let's us experiment with what this looks like. So we'll start with the default, which is to say that I'm going to come in here, and now we're working with JSON, remember, so one thing we need is a comma after each of our properties, and I'm going to say background color. Okay, so some of you get, and it's been great, you guys have been asking questions in class, like how do we know, is this a Google thing, is this a JavaScript thing, right? So everything that happens right now is going to be within the Google specification, and we know that in part because it's in the API. So for background color, I'm going to go ahead and, again, referring to my documentation here, I see that background color, it's a string or object, white is the default. They give this as a possible color, so let's look at it. So one thing that we see is that it has to be a string, which means it needs to be contained in quotation marks. You guys hopefully remember, or you may remember from our discussion the other day, that we can enclose this in single or double quotation marks. I'm going to do single here because that's what's sort of specified in the API. And again, I'm going to upload my example. Say yes. And see what happens. Hopefully this is a visible difference. Oh boy, and it is a visible difference. Okay, we should never ever have a chart with that color background, I'm almost certain. In fact, if you can find me a chart that should have that color background, then you get extra credit, because I can't imagine one. Actually, a really interesting thing that we see that's happening here with the visibility of our lines, there's sort of this ombre effect going on with our vertical axis lines, which is really interesting. It's amazing how this is actually a really great example of how our perception of color is affected by the other colors around something. So that's great. I've now experimented with this, and I can sort of see how it works. So if I were in sort of elaborating the documentation here, I would probably say something like, I would want to put in the format for this, that this is going to say something like background color, right? I'm going to do a less offensive color here, and actually this is not exactly where I would do this. We'll give you guys a specific format, but that we see, okay, this is one valid way to embody this property. Now, there's another option on the documentation that says this can be an object, and an object with the following properties. So we start to see here is, oh, okay, so stroke, stroke width, and fill, right? So when we just use the plain string, we get a background fill. We don't appear to get any sort of outline around the chart. And of course, if we had an outline, we would need to do things like figure out what thickness and what color it should be. So what I'm going to do now, and this is the part that I want to draw your attention to, is that when I see this dot, what it means is there's going to be an object within the object that I already have. So when I see background color dot stroke, the way that's going to look in my code here is background color, okay, and then I'm going to see stroke, and what are the appropriate values for this? Let's check the documentation again. Is going to be the color of the chart border as an HTML color string. So I'm going to go ahead and use this #666 that they've given me. Actually, we really shouldn't use that. That's a shorthand, which can be used with certain kinds of numbers, but you should really include all six numbers for a hexadecimal, just for consistency's sake. So if I upload this here, again, what do I get? Oops, not a whole heck of a lot. Let's try that out again. Background color, stroke. What if I do fill? And, okay, so here's a good point. Why did I not see anything with that stroke? Well, because I hadn't set a stroke width, right? So let's change this to stroke width, right? And so this is where I'm like, oh, did I do it wrong? Well, actually, it turns out the default width of that stroke, of the border, is 0. So naturally, even if I set a color for it, if I don't say that it should have some width, I'm not going to see a lot. I'm not going to see a lot going on. And no, the other thing let's see, it says it should be a number, so border width in pixels. So I don't need to put this in quotation marks because it should be of a number format. So let's go ahead and make it a little bit bulky here. And then I'm going to say fill, which is my third property, and I'm going to give it this nice sort of safe light gray here. And go ahead and upload that. Okay, and give this a reload. Now we see something that looks a bit more sensible. So the main emphasis that I want to place on this here is how to understand reading this documentation, which is to say that when we see something that has a dot property in it, what it means is that that is a parameter of the object that can be assigned to that value. So now I realize that I have two ways that I can manipulate the background. I can just choose a straight up color, right? Or I can do something where I say, by the way, it's going to look something more like this, right? It's going to be an object, which I know because it's curly braces, and it's going to say stroke, and I can put a color in here like dark gray, okay? And that's a valid value, except I would probably want to note to myself, right, only works if there is a width set, right? As we saw before, right? If I don't set a width, then I don't see anything. And we can see how this could build up. And in fact, I could just do a single example for all of them, which would be to say, you know, hey, here's a background color object with all of these things set. So you can see that I can set, in some cases it's dependent which ones I set. I need to set all of them, or certain ones don't really have any effect, any visible effect, unless I've set the others. Right? Stroke width. But notice how these are all JSON objects, right? They're all just, oops, that's a number. They're all just JSON objects. So as long as we, you know, can keep our objects together with some clarity, like, we can do a lot of manipulation on this. So basically, that's going to be that's actually the main element of what we're doing next week. And we're going to take a look at this in class and exactly how we want you guys to do this documentation. But pretty much what we'd like you to do before next class, if possible, is to do some messing around with this. Now, you don't have to do it in your own code. I would actually strongly recommend that you do it in the Google Visualization Playground. So in case you've lost that, you can always get to it from this page where it's going to give you that option here, right? So I can open this link in a new tab and take a look at this, and I can start to play with all of these options. So for next week, we're going to post this to Laura, but for next week, what you're going to have is you're going to be assigned some section of the Google visualization of the bar chart configuration options that you need to elaborate and sort of describe what it does. If you are able to kind of test it out here in the browser, that's fantastic. That's going to be part of your assignment for the following day. It's going to be actually to write that out in code. So if you have any questions or concerns, feel free to reach out. But otherwise, you know, have a great weekend, and we'll look forward to seeing you next week.